Good Tuesday afternoon to each and every one of you. Thank you so much for joining us today in our continued study through the Judges. We were off last week as Alan and his family were being beach bums, but we are glad for them having some time away to recuperate and to spend some time with family. We're thankful for your patience and we're thankful that you're back with us as we continue to work our way through Judges. We are in the final portion of this book within the Old Testament, and it is really, well, Alan, it's a doozy, isn't it? It is as bad as we might have thought things were in the narrative of the judges themselves. Well, the ending of the book tells us exactly how bad things were. But we're thankful to have you, thankful to have Alan. As always, Alan, thanks for being back, man.
That's why I ran away to avoid this avoid this dumpster fire here for one more week. But yeah, we had a good time. Glad to be back. Glad that we got back. And there, when we left, there was we had just finished all the snow. So time we got back, it was much better weather up here. So we're happy to. I'm happy it's springtime, and only one more week till the time change too, which I'm happy about.
Yeah, whenever you told me about that yesterday, I completely forgot that it was already that time of year. But we appreciate you bringing some warmer weather back with you. I think the 70s this week is very much welcomed. But we are thankful for all of God's blessings, thankful for you being able to get away and get back to us, and thankful for the time to be in God's word today. It is a difficult section of scripture that we're going to be covering today, Judges chapter 17 and 18. But I do believe there are important lessons for us to learn as we go through this narrative portion of the Judges text. Before we get there, let's just catch us up real quick about what we've seen in Judges. One of the primary focuses of the Judges is to show this cycle of sin that is present nearly the entirety of the narrative portion that we see of the Judges themselves from chapter 2 all the way through chapter 19, which is what we're going to see here in just a moment. What we see is faithfulness to God. Yahweh, the God of Israel, is obviously what is expected. And whenever that is present, then things are going to go well. Yet, because of the situation that Israel finds themselves in, being surrounded, unfortunately, even though it wasn't necessary to be the case, as they're surrounded by pagan people, that influence pushes them into paganistic tendencies, paganistic worship, paganistic ideas, and because of that unfaithfulness to Yahweh as their one true God, they are punished. God raises up a nation or a people to oppress them, and through this oppression, the hope is that they'll be pushed back towards God. They cry out to God for deliverance. He would raise up for them a judge who would deliver them, and through that deliverance the people would return in faithfulness to God, and then the cycle would start over again. We see that so many times throughout this book, throughout the narrative portion here of Judges, specifically with the judges themselves, those who are the warlords or the saviors, the deliverers of Israel. But unfortunately, as we go throughout the story, what we see is things just continue to grow worse and worse. We see that the prologue of this particular book from chapter 1, of course, through chapter 3 and verse 6. And then we see the judges show up on the scene, first with Othniel, and then Ehud and Shamgar, Deborah and Barak, Gideon twice. Really, we have a very long section for Gideon. Then we see Abimelech and Tola, Jair, Jephthah, Ibzan, Elon, Abdon, and Samson. Concludes with Samson, and then we get into the epilogue. And as you can see from this visual, which is this downward spiral, or as Philip Martin calls it, the fatal funnel, we see things, as I mentioned earlier, just growing worse and worse. The judges themselves grow worse, and it shouldn't be surprised that the overall situation within Israel is worse because of their pagan influences that has affected them. Their decision making becomes worse. The acts of evil become worse, and really the nation as a whole grows worse. And that unfortunately affects the judges as well. For the faith that Samson showed in moments, and even so much so to be mentioned among the Hall of Faith in Hebrews, there was a lot of really poor decision making that took place within his life, and it really caused a lot of issues, not just for him, but for the nation as a whole. One of the other aspects of Judges that we want to mention real fast is just the parallel nature of many of these Judges stories. As you can see on the screen, the prologue and the epilogue, there's a number of good comparisons, but also some important contrasting elements to these stories. We're going to note a few of those as we go throughout, but then you can also see the same for the judges, and then even Gideon. Gideon's own story has its own prologue and epilogue, and there are a number of parallels that take place between them. But we have finished up, Alan, with the judges portion of Judges. We're not going to see any more of those particular type of individuals or characters within the story, and yet that doesn't mean that there is not going to be some highlighted characters here. We're going to meet one of those in Judges chapter 17, which is a man by the name of Micah, and we're going to see how his story feeds into this finishing epilogue of the book of Judges. Alan, why don't you kick us off here in Judges 17? Get us into what we're going to look at today in Judges 17 and 18.
Right. Yeah, we'll go ahead and at least read 17 here first. There was a man from the hill country of Ephraim named Micah. He said to his mother, "The 1,100 pieces of silver taken from you, and that I heard you place a curse on, here's the silver. I took it." Then his mother said, "My son, may you be blessed by the Lord." He returned the 1,100 pieces of silver to his mother, and his mother said, "I personally consecrate the silver to the Lord for my son's benefit to make a carved image and a silver idol. I will give it back to you." So he returned the silver to his mother, and she took 5 pounds of silver and gave it to a silversmith. He made it into a carved image and a silver idol, and it was in Micah's house. This man Micah had a shrine, and he made an ephod and household idols, and installed one of his sons to be his priest. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did whatever seemed right to him. There was a young man, a Levite from Bethlehem in Judah, who was staying within the clan of Judah. The man left the town of Bethlehem in Judah to stay wherever he could find a place. On his way, he came to Micah's home in the hill country of Ephraim. "Where do you come from?" Micah asked him. He answered him, "I am a Levite from Bethlehem in Judah, and I'm going to stay wherever I can find a place." Micah replied, "Stay with me and be my father and priest, and I will give you 4 ounces of silver a year, along with your clothing and provisions." So the Levite went in and agreed to stay with the man, and the young man became like one of his sons. Micah consecrated the Levite, and the young man became his priest and lived in Micah's house. Then Micah said, "Now I know that the Lord will be good to me because a Levite has become my priest." I love that. Uh, I love how confusing. I've always kind of been confused at the first part of the story, and I think that's kind of the point. Like none of these things that takes place is normal. Like what we would think is the right thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
Um, this man apparently we don't get the beginning story. We kind of jump in the middle. He's taken 1,100 pieces of silver from his own mother. She places a curse on it, and then he admits to it and gives it back, and then she's like, you would think she's supposed to be mad or just forgive him, and then what does she do? She makes an idol. Like, none of this really makes sense, and I feel like that's kind of the point. I
Right.
mean, really all of this story to me has two purposes. One, to just kind of show the state of things,
Mm-hmm.
and everything's backwards. A son stealing from his mother a large sum, the mother, just not thinking it's a big deal, and then the reaction to make part of it and make a carved image. I think it's supposed to show just how backwards things are right now. And then I think the second big purpose of this is just the origin of these idols, where they came from, because they're going to play a part into the next chapter
Right.
as well.
Yeah, I think if we're gonna figure out the foundation of this story, Alan, I think it's got to be verse 6. In those days, as you read,
Sure.
there was no king in Israel. Everyone did whatever seemed right to him, or the traditional way of this being said. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. This is really the precipice for everything that we see. And really, whenever you read this on the surface, you might think that what's being referred to here is purely um, from a nationalistic perspective, that there's no king, that there's no head man who is going to rule the nation. But I really think that there's a double meaning here, and really I believe the emphasis ought to be put on the spiritual truth of what's being said here. There was no king in Israel in the fact that God was not revered as the king that he ought to have been, which allowed them then to do everything that was right in their own eyes. I mean, how ridiculous is it that you have a man here named Micah, whose name literally means who is like Yahweh or God? His name literally speaks to the uniqueness and special nature of God. And yet here he is setting up worship to God in a paganistic way. That's one of the things that we see here within this chapter, and then in 18 as well, and even into 19, is the synchronistic nature of worship in these chapters. That there is worship to God, but it has been influenced from a pagan perspective. The fact that there is an ephod that's mentioned here, that there are idols, that there are shrines that have been built up in Micah's own house, goes directly against what we see within the giving of the law. Deuteronomy chapter let's see here. Deuteronomy chapter 12 speaks explicitly against building up personal shrines. Judges 8:27 speaks of Gideon's own ephod that he set up, which led to further issue. The household idols, these teraphim, are rebuked in Zechariah 10 and verse 2. And all of this, even leading into the Levite being introduced here. As you mentioned, everything's upside down and nothing is as it ought to be. Speaking to what you're talking about with the curses, that was a big deal for us. We might not understand that the really vital nature of a curse here, but that was something that really worried people in this time. The ancients believed that curses, this calling of a deity to hold somebody accountable for something wrong that they have done. Micah obviously believed that there was power in a curse. That's why he returned the money. And a curse itself would have been something that was, again, calling on the name of a deity and asking for them to either to do ill towards somebody who's done something wrong, where you would say, I hope their land has a famine. I hope their family doesn't prosper. I hope they have no children. And if that's what takes place here, then we might understand a little more why the mom is willing to forgive, because of course she doesn't want her own son not to produce grandchildren, not to have his family prospered. And what does she do with this? Instead of holding him accountable for what he's done, not only does she not hold him accountable, but then she gives him the ability to worship in a paganistic way. And it is, I think you really said it well, the way everything ought to go in this text goes the exact opposite way. And if we really wanted to understand the degree to which things are going the wrong way, all we need to do is insert a Levite. Which, Alan, think about this for a second. How often are Levites mentioned in Judges up to this point, really?
As far as I know, they haven't been mentioned
Yeah,
at
I mean,
all.
not much at all. And whenever they are mentioned, finally in chapter 17, what seems to be the state of the Levites? Do they seem to be the strong foundation of the Israelite people? Well, no. What we're seeing here is that even the Levites are corrupt. The state of Israel, as described here at this moment, is so bad that even the Levites themselves, the spiritual leaders, aren't what they ought to be. Well, I mean, what's the deal with this Levite to begin with, Alan? What seems to be his goal? What's he trying to do in leaving Bethlehem of Judah and just going about trying to find a place to stay? What's he doing here, and how does that play into the future?
Well, one interesting thing is he comes from Bethlehem. We're familiar with Bethlehem, but that's not a Levite city. That's a Judean city. So what's he doing? I mean, the Levites had their, especially, I think, 48 different cities, the cities of refuge. They had their special, they didn't have their own territory like the rest of the tribes, but they had these Levitical cities kind of scattered through. So they weren't supposed to be just scattered completely and just one Levite in every household or every town. They were supposed to, remain in their allotted towns. So that's kind of weird to begin with. It mentions he's to me, all this whole chapter is just highlighting the lack of leadership, positive leadership that's going on in Israel at this time. And we've seen the named leaders, the judges, we've seen them just kind of deteriorate and we actually have some when it talks about the 1,100 pieces of silver, that kind of harkens back to the last leader we mentioned, which was Samson.
Right.
And I mean, he was sold by Delilah for the same amount. I mean, that seems to be a little bit too coincidental to be an accident. So I think we're supposed to think about comparing this Micah guy to Samson, but also, I mean, he's more like Delilah, and that he got this 1,100 pieces of silver through dishonest means. I mean, that's the type of person he is. And Delilah, I mean, obviously she's not a good character, but at least she's a Philistine. She's not even an Israelite.
You would expect that type of behavior from
Yeah.
her. You would not expect this type of behavior from this specific man based upon who he is.
And then verse 5, when it mentions the ephod and the household idols, that's where we get that tie back to the last half of Gideon. I mean, Gideon had his faults, and really that latter half is where he kind of really tailed off. So, I mean, this is the type of leadership they're suffering from. And then in comes this Levite. I mean, he's described as a young man, and Micah even just says, stay with me, be my father and my priest. I'll basically pay your wages. That's not really how the priesthood worked. They weren't supposed to be, hire themselves out for to a household and be under the thumb of somebody else. Clearly Micah's not a Levite of any kind. We don't know exactly what tribe he's from, but I mean, when he's looking for a Levite, we kind of assume he's not a Levite. So the Levites were supposed to be the spiritual leaders, those that knew the law, and Micah kind of sees. I almost get the sense Micah's using his status as a Levite just to, for his own gain. He doesn't really care. He doesn't think that he's going to come in and help him be more spiritual. But it's almost like a good luck charm. You mentioned right at the end of verse 13, now I know that the Lord will be good to me because a Levite has become my priest. Well, that's the mindset of the people that back then. It was almost like a checklist religion. Like, okay, we worship God. We have an idol to God. I mean, this is idolatry, but not really pagan idolatry. Just they were worshiping God in the wrong way. Well, it makes sense that they would kind of see Levites as a good luck charm in that same kind of twisted way. That's really the point of all these chapters, just to show that even those that profess to worship God weren't doing it in any sort of correct way.
Right. It is very obvious that the Israelites themselves are becoming very Cananistic in so many ways. The pagan Canaan idolatry has infiltrated the people of Israel. And though that's one of the contrasting elements of this epilogue from the prologue. In the prologue, we do see paganistic issues. But what are they doing instead of, and they're doing in that text, is they're going after the Baals and the Ashereths, and they're worshiping the Canaanite gods, which is a complete separation from Yahweh. But here, it really, I believe, is worse, that they've taken their worship of Yahweh, and they haven't abandoned him altogether, no, but they're allowing the paganistic influence to show in the way that they worship Yahweh, which is completely rejected in the law itself, that they were to worship Yahweh according to his standards. But for them to allow these paganistic gods to dictate how they worship Yahweh, that surely was a slap in the face. Now, this Levi that we were talking about, his name is later, I believe, revealed to us as being Jonathan. That's in chapter 18 and verse 30. I believe it speaks about his sons being the priests for this particular for the worship that's done with these idols and such. And then just to give some clarification, I think what we see in verses 7 through 13 is a expounding upon of what we see in verses 5 and 6. So whenever it reads that he installed in verse 5 one of his sons to be his priest, I believe 17 through 13 is given the detail of how that happens, because he says, I will take you in even as one of my sons. The man became to him like one of his sons. Well, who is this guy? Again, as you mentioned, he's a Levite, but he's not behaving as a Levite ought to behave. He is basically he's a spiritual mercenary, is the way that I describe him in my notes that I'm taking here in my margins. He's offered this position being a father and a priest. The idea of being a father is someone who has authority in spiritual matters, who has expertise in spiritual matters. I kind of chuckled that the issue here of having this young Levite serving in this position is ridiculous. But I don't think things will really change all that much today, where we have men my age, 30 and even younger, who describe themselves as being pastors of a church, who are the spiritual leader of a church, who is going to help guide a church. Well, that does not accurately depict who a pastor is within the New Testament. A pastor,
when you have a 18-year-old elder knock at your door.
yeah. Well, that even that, yeah. We're talking specifically about the can't say the Mormon church. That's not something they like anymore. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Whenever they knock on the door, the elders, same thing. It's just everything here is so off, and it's so ridiculous, and yet it's just going to get worse. What happens here in chapter 17 plays directly into what we see in chapter 18. So lest we think that the issue is only within a single family, let's take a step back here and realize that these issues are even prevalent within entire tribes. The tribe that we're speaking of specifically, that's introduced in chapter 18, is the tribe of Dan. If we remember back in chapter 1 in verse 34, as all these other tribes are settling in within the land that's been allotted to them, as they're all doing the work in seeking to conquer those who inhabit those lands, we don't see Dan doing that. In fact, we see Dan failing miserably in taking the land that has been given to them. The Amorites forced the Danites into the hill country and did not allow them to go down into the valley. The Amorites were determined to stay in Har-Harez, in Ajalon, in Shabim. And when the house of Joseph got the upper hand, the Ammonites were made to serve as forced labor. But notice specifically what happens with Dan. That they're not able to take the land that has been given to them. In a sense, they reject what God has given to them. And now what we see in chapter 18 is them trying to find their own land. Instead of being sufficed with what God has given, they're going to try to do things their own way. So, Alan, why don't you give us some detail about what's taking place here in chapter 18?
Well, it starts off with another one of those. There's no king in Israel. Just a reminder that we're still in the same kind of general story because Micah's still involved, but it's kind of moving forward to the next chapter. So these Danites, verse 2, they send out 5 brave men, and they're going to go explore the land, and they're kind of going through the hill country of Ephraim, and they happen to pass through the home of Micah, and they meet this young Levite there in verse 3 and start to inquire about him. Now you would think, if the Danites were doing what's right, they would see what all's going on. We got this random Levite, kind of doing his own thing. They've got idols in the household. This should have been a bunch of red flags to the point where they should have, punished the house of Micah. And what do they do? Verse 5, they said, "Please inquire of God for us to determine if we will have successful journeys." So they're going to, use this Levite just to see if the Lord is with them. Verse 6, he tells them the party line here: "Go in peace. The Lord is watching over your journey." I would be very surprised if he actually got a message from God that this was true or not. He was just, giving his blessing just like a Catholic priest does today.
Which, Alan, that goes back to what we see in chapter 17. We're trying to find this connection. How does 17 lead into 18? Well, again, think about what Micah has done. He set up an ephod and household idols. Both of these were used for divination, which is not the proper way in which people were to determine the will of God. They were paganistic practices in order to do such. So here they find this Levite who's out of place, but instead, as you said, instead of trying to rebuke him and get things corrected, they say, "Hey, why don't you go ahead and use these paganistic practices in order to tell us what's going on?" And of course, I think you're accurate in what you're saying. Just give them the kind of the party line, which is, "Hey, everything's fine. Go ahead." What I read from the commentary I was looking at, the let me see here specifically, what, make sure I get the right, that maybe the better understanding of what he said was more so of, well, the Lord is before you on your journey. It's very ambiguous. You have,
Yeah.
I mean, it really means nothing, and yet it's enough for these Levites to think, okay, well, God's going to be with us. There's a whole lot of assumption in these chapters, Alan, 17, 18, about what God thinks, and yet we have zero inspired um, understanding of what God thinks. There's a lot of assumptions from these people who want to think God is thinking this way, but we're not told that's how God's thinking at all, which again just shows how far they've fallen from where they ought to be.
The story continues. These 5 men, they have to travel basically all the way to the northern reaches of Israel, of the promised land, and they find just kind of a quiet town of Sidonians, which is eventually, yeah, way up at the top there, where Laish, which it's titled Dan, that'll get named later, but that's where they're at. And you can see the distance from there to Sidon is what, maybe 30, 40 miles.
Not far at all.
So these are not, this is not an Israelite city, but they are so disconnected from Sidon. There we go. They're so disconnected from Sidon that they don't really have an alliance with anyone. So they don't have a bunch of allies ready to come and help defend them. So notice what the Danites are doing. They had trouble with the Amorites in their territory down south. So now they're going to find the easiest, quietest little peaceful town they can, because that'll be much easier. They don't have the faith and the ability, the trust to be able to take the hard stuff. So they're just going to go with what's easiest. And you see the numbers. I mean, verse 11, 600 Danites departed from Zorah. I would assume, I mean, this is about the bulk of their force. I mean, we'd have to go back to the book of Numbers and see what their numbers were like. But I think, part of what we're seeing, we see this 600, and then eventually Benjamin's going to get, whittled down to next to nothing. We're seeing a reversal. I mean, remember the promise to Abraham back in the day. I mean, this was supposed to be a people as numerous as the stars in heaven, as numerous as the sand on the seashore. Well, because of their lack of faith, their lack of placing their trust in God, they were not growing. They were shrinking to the point where Dan is, almost down to, maybe a couple thousand people total. Benjamin's going to get almost completely wiped out. A lot of these minor tribes, you don't even hear from again. Really, from this point on, I mean, Simeon is going to completely disappear from the biblical narrative. Zebulun and Naphtali and Gad and Reuben, all those eastern tribes. I mean, after this, really kind of focus on Judah and Benjamin, and then Ephraim's really the only other one that's kind of named very often in the rest of the Bible, except for a handful of times. And some of them you don't even hear from again. So these tribes are disappearing. And part of that might be some intermarriage and stuff, but I mean, their identities and, their assimilation into Canaanite culture is taking away their identity as their own tribe. Much less, I mean, there's no national identity yet. I mean, there's no nation of Israel. It even doesn't even really mention Israel as a whole. It just kind of talks about, the people did what was right in their own. It just says the people, so they're really just at a very low point here. But you see you wrote down how far they had to travel all the way from what was supposed to be their territory all the way to the north. And they do I mean, I don't know I guess God gave them a little bit of success. They were able to basically massacre this peaceful, easy village. And then they rebuilt on top of the village and renamed it Dan. And I think another big reason for this story we'll see later on is the history that comes after, during the united and divided kingdom, the history that comes from this city of Dan,
Mhm.
and just the history of idolatry that it has. So I think that's a big reason for why we're hearing this kind of random story here at the end of Judges.
Absolutely, and it does give us great insight into why things happen the way they happen later on. And one of the things I want to mention, Alan, just looking at the story of chapter 18, is we've noted before the lack of chronology that seems to be present here within Judges. That it is not as if these judges came one after the other, after the other, after the other. There could have been some overlap between them because many of these stories were regional stories.
Mm-hmm.
And what we have here is regarding not the nation of Israel as a whole, because that really hasn't happened yet, but more so just this specific people. And some of the things that I also want to mention here, or along those lines, the possible time frame, it could very well be that this is taking place around the time of chapter 1.
Yeah.
That as they're talking about being not being able to possess the land, that here is some further explanation of what happened during that time. And it should not surprise us then that as the story of the judges themselves grows worse and worse, that we have here the story of this particular nation or this particular people, and their story is growing worse and worse as we continue on. There's a number of echoes that are showing up here within this story, Alan. One of them to me is you mentioned this, the really anti-conquest. You think about the contrasting elements of these two stories. So back in Numbers 13, they are told to what? Go into this land, and what do they find? They find a great land. That's very similar to what we have here in regards to Laish, because this was the best freshwater spring in all the land. There was water, there was an abundance of water, which of course was a very vital resource. So they have, just as they had Canaan being a land overflowing with milk and honey, here they have a land overflowing with fresh water that was this valuable resource. In Numbers 13, they come up against a mighty army, or a mighty people, and instead of focusing on the strength that God was going to provide to them, they're fearful and they're not willing to go up and take the land as is offered to them. Well, here the opposite is true. They don't see any really sort of obstacles in order to overtake this land. Kenneth Wade talks about maybe because of the vast resources of the land and kind of some of the natural barriers of where Laish was located, they were really complacent and not really worried about people overtaking them, which was why it was such an easy conquest. They just went in there, wiped everyone out, killed them with the edge of the sword, uh, burned the city, and then they just rebuilt it, and it became what we end up seeing Dan being, which is this very paganistic type of place. Verse 30, that the Danites set up the carved images for themselves, and Jonathan, the son of Gershom, son of Moses, which has Septuagint support. That probably is the best understanding of it, which again shows the problem here. It was Aaron and his sons who were going to be the Levites and the priest, but instead of that taking place, we see maybe it does Moses, who serves in this role. His sons were the priest when until the time of the exile from the land. I think that might be another timestamp there, Alan. It gives us probably a good understanding when this writing was composed, that it was very much later on written as an explanation of the history of the people, and so that they could learn from it. But it also lets us know that what's happening here, God's going to act upon it. He's going to bring judgment. And he's going to bring judgment upon these people for erecting this priesthood, this invalid priesthood, which allowed for all these paganistic type of images, or paganistic influences to infiltrate the worship of God. And we also see another timestamp that it was there as long as the house of God was in Shiloh, which was the first permanent home of the tabernacle. So that tells us a little bit what happens here with Laish and the establishing of the city of Dan. But what do we see? What's the tie-in from chapter 17 in regards to Micah and his household? You already saw that they found this man. They saw what he's going to do. He gives them what they believe is positive support for what they're doing. Yet along the way, they're going to end up coming back to Micah's house. And they've already met this priest once, but what did they do with this priest moving forward?
Well,
What
before it was
allows him to
just
go from Micah's house and being his priest, his home priest, to being the priest for their people?
before, back in I guess verse 14, it was just the 5 men. And now when they return, they've scouted the land. They figure out they're gonna go up to Laish, and then they come back to get the rest of their army. And along the way, we're gonna pass through Micah's house again with 600 armed men.
Mm-hmm.
So Micah, and it's kind of ironic, Micah's setting kind of like some of the judges earlier. I feel like he's kind of setting himself up as this kind of regional warlord or regional leader. He's established his own local religion, basically. He's pretty wealthy. I mean, he had a bunch of money he stole from his mom. So, I mean, their family is pretty wealthy. So it's ironic that here come these Danites, and instead of, killing them probably like they should for worshiping idols, they steal the idols from Micah, and they steal his Levite from him. They convince the Levite to follow them. So
He's a
Micah's
spiritual mercenary, Alan.
Yep.
Whoever's going to offer the best job, he's going to take it.
So the Levite goes with them. Micah's left with absolutely nothing, but his legacy is that this idolatry, this that he started. They took the ephod and all the little household idols, and then that kind of gets established up with the Danites and Laish, and the Levite. We get his name here, Jonathan. You mentioned son of Gershom, son of Moses. So assuming that this isn't skipping over generations, this would be Moses's grandson. So pretty early into the judges period, if we're only, I'm assuming that Moses probably had he had a son, obviously, before he died. And probably maybe this grandson, it says he was a young man. So maybe he was alive during the time of Moses, or at least he was born soon after so we can't be talking about more than, maybe 30, 40 years after the death of Moses. So pretty soon to be having all of this stuff happening. I know. I think some older. You mentioned this is probably Moses. There's a couple older. Maybe I think the King James that says Manassas.
Mm-hmm.
Those two names in Hebrew like one slash different. So
Right.
Easily, just like if I wrote a T when I meant to do an L. Well, the only difference is the cross through the middle. It's one easy scribal error, or I think probably more than likely they just didn't want to admit that Moses' grandson turned out to be such a bad guy.
Right.
So they might have did that on purpose. But the correct translation, I think, is Moses, which just shows, even just the depths that the things have fallen, even amongst Moses' own family, in 2 generations or more. We already have this apostasy happening, and it continues all the way to the time of the exile. So, like you said, it gives a timestamp probably for when the book was finished and compiled, which also helps us kind of see why it was gathered and compiled in a certain way. It was and so well organized. This wasn't just someone that was living this and writing down like a diary. This was people going back and seeing, oh, this is where we're at now, and here's why. The history of the judges here, and we'll see that Dan, the city, comes into play in the days of Jeroboam after the kingdom splits. And you remember he sets up 2 golden calves, or two idols, in Dan and Bethel. Both, Bethel being a very, kind of a high place, a very religious city, even during the days of the judges, or even going back into, the days of Jacob. But of course, Dan had this history of, its own established priesthood that apparently was never really completely done away with all the way to the time of the exile. So, it doesn't really get mentioned much, but you see just, these things that are set up even at this kind of early part of the Israelite story. It's going to be a problem for next 300 or 400 years.
Absolutely. And that really gets us to a couple of takeaway points from these 2 chapters. Number one, if we take this all the way back to chapter 1, whenever you don't do originally what God has said you ought to do, then don't be surprised whenever you end up someplace that God does not want you to be. If you're not willing to take care of business on the front end, don't be surprised whenever the outcome is not what it ought to be. But then secondly, one of the real warnings of these particular chapters, and what we're going to see continuing on as well, is the real importance of avoiding synchronistic worship of God. That we don't allow the outside influences to shape and mold how we worship God. They had everything they needed to have within the law that dictated how worship of the Lord ought to be carried out, where it ought to be carried out, by who it ought to be carried out by, and then how it ought to be carried out. Instead of relying upon that instruction, we see here the paganistic influences infiltrating the worship of God. And what does it lead to? It leads to not only this type of worship, but it leads to the absence of God. That is one of the most striking elements of these two chapters. Is God is just not here. His name is invoked on a number of occasions, but God himself and the inspired writers do not mention God as approving or even being present within this text. And that really ought to say something to us concerning what he thinks about what is happening within these two chapters. It's not good. Things are not looking very bright. And unfortunately, they're only going to get worse as we continue into chapter 19. Hope you'll join us for that on Friday. Alan, do you have any closing thoughts you want to leave us with before we close out for today?
Yeah, I just kind of want to reiterate too, just this theme of worship in these chapters, I think is the key, and I think that's something that is applicable even now. Just how easy it is for our own worship, our corporate worship services, or just how easily it is for our own lives to kind of slowly mesh with the world. Things like singing. How many churches have gone the way of instruments and music and all of these things that the world is doing. So why shouldn't we join in with that? And or I mean, just how and when and why we worship, or how often, Sunday morning, Sunday night, all those things. It's easy for us to look elsewhere and see what other places are doing and try to, kind of, if not join, then kind of be influenced by them. Well, that's not the pattern we see here. We should be looking at the scripture, figuring out what God desires and doing our best to please him in that way, not let, because so-and-so church did that, or so-and-so religion does this, we can kind of mold ourselves toward that. We're supposed to be transformed by the word of God, not the other way around, not transformed, by the world. So this is, it seems like one of those obscure chapters that doesn't have anything to do with us. And then when you dive in deep, it really is applicable even today.
Right. We cannot allow things outside of the Lord's instruction to influence us in what we do. We need to make sure everything that we do is in line with what he desires of us. Hey, now listen, if people outside of us happen to be doing that as well, cool, good for them, but they're not our standard. We do things by what the Bible dictates, what God authorizes us to do and instructs us to do. And that must be our commitment, to not allow even modern paganistic influences to infiltrate our way of thinking, our way of acting, our way of worshiping, whatever it is. We need to make sure that we can go to the book and we can find the roots for why it is we do what we do. Great thoughts, Alan. Thank you so much. And thank you for joining us today in this study. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to let us know. We'd love to interact with you about this text or any other questions you might have about biblical things. If you're looking to join a group for Bible study tomorrow night, you're more than welcome to join us at our church house at 384 Pleasant Plains Road in Jackson. We're going to be continuing our study in Ecclesiastes. You're welcome to join us in person or here online if you can't be with us in person. Join us, though, on Friday as we continue our study through the book of the Judges. Chapter 19 is going to be on the schedule for that day. Hope you'll join us for that study. Again, thank you for being here. God bless you in all that you do, and hope you'll join us next time as we continue our walk through history, the story of God's word as found within the scriptures. God bless. Everyone take care.